Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Berlin. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where I run the Council's Financing and Achieving Cost Competitive Climate Solutions program. Our program has many aspects, and the first thing we're doing is we are going to publish shortly a deep dive into the principal metric used to compare the cost of generating renewable energy and fossil fuel-based energy, the levelized cost of electricity. That analysis will show that the renewable energy is cheaper to generate than fossil fuel-based energy, but it really only analyzes the cost of generation. It doesn't analyze the cost of transmission and distribution and other infrastructure issues, and these can be significant and can change the balance. So we'll be working on that in the second phase, and this conference really relates to that because we are at an inflection point in our energy transmission and distribution system. It's old. I think it averages over 40 years old. It uses outdated technology. It wasn't designed for renewable energy, the many connection points there. So the system has to be really rebuilt and expanded as we go forward. Now that raises the absolutely critical issue of how quickly can this be done. And right now the permitting system does not work in a period where we need to rapidly transition to clean energy. On the average, it takes 5 to 10 years for a new permit to be, for a new set of permits to be granted and a project authorized. There was recently an example in California in the last month or so where a transmission line was approved 18 years after it was proposed. We have to figure out how to shorten that process. And that really raises three critical sets of issues. The first issue is what are the steps that have to be taken to make this system more efficient, to make it work more quickly and more effectively? What are the really key things we need to do that? The second issue is, can this be done in a way that maintains the environmental integrity of the permitting process and it maintains the integrity of the environmental justice review process? How do we do that? What steps need to be taken? Because I believe, of course, it's absolutely critical we do that. And the third is, can we develop the system in the most cost-effective and efficient way so that we can take this cheaply generated renewable energy and distribute it to people as reasonably as possible? I hope we'll discuss all these issues in the session today. We're going to follow this session up in the next month or so with the session on the planning process, which has equal barriers that need to be overcome to ensure there's efficient planning in developing these transmission distribution lines and infrastructure. The project has a number of other critical things we're working on. We're working on a major sovereign loan guarantee program for investment in emerging markets to really enable these investments to scale up very rapidly. We'll be working on nature-based solutions to the climate crisis, including forestry and biodiversity issues. So with that background, let me start off by introducing the first of our two keynote speakers, Representative Sean Casten from Illinois' 6th Congressional District. Congressman Casten is a dedicated climate advocate, one of the leading advocates in the country, who brings ample private sector experience to his work. He's a scientist. He was a clean energy entrepreneur. He's a CEO, and he has dedicated his life really to fighting climate change. With California Representative Mike Levin, Representative Casten released a discussion draft of the Clean Energy and Transmission Acceleration Act, CETA, in the House, legislation that aims to address bottlenecks in clean energy and transmission permitting reform. Representative Casten has a Master of Engineering Management and a Master of Science in Biochemical Engineering from the Thayer School of Engineering at Dartmouth College. I could go on in the representative's background, but I think that's enough, and I will turn it over to him now to give his keynote address. And thank you very much for appearing today, Congressman.
Thank you so much, Ken. That's a more than enough phrase. I certainly don't need it. So I thought I'd give a little bit of a lay of the land of sort of where the politics of permitting are in the United States, and then try to close with some thoughts on how this I anticipate will play out with some of our European allies. But by way of context, Mike Levin and I, who you had mentioned, we introduced the CETA bill. We served on the climate committee for the past 2 terms in Congress. Neither of us serves on it anymore because I guess we solved the climate crisis because the new majority got rid of the climate committee. But the work of that climate committee became ultimately the Inflation Reduction Act, which I can say without hyperbole is the single biggest climate bill ever passed by any government anywhere. And let us not forget is about 40% of what is necessary. That realizing the roughly 40% CO2 reduction that all the modelers have said we're going to realize in that bill is paced primarily by the US transmission system. Depending on whose analysis you need to do, we need to build transmission at anywhere from 3 to 5 times the rate that we have ever built transmission in this country, if we are to realize those gains, which makes sense, right? Because we're electrifying loads like vehicles that didn't used to have a wire connected to them. We're adding generation in places that aren't necessarily on the grid, but it's where the wind is, where the sun is, where the geothermal is. And we need to connect those wires. And it is devilishly difficult to build wires because of permitting issues in the United States. Now, tragically, the really prior to this term, there has never been a comprehensive bill in Congress to address the transmission issues. There have been pieces, but even the package that was brought forth out of the Senate last term was only incidentally about transmission. And so what Mike and I tried to do was to bring that together. We have this discussion draft now. It's out there. We'll release final text shortly. But we basically tried to address this through what I'd characterize as the 3 Ps: profits, permitting, and participation. On the profit side, in the United States, most people who are grid operators who are obligated to ensure that our grid remains robust and reliable have a very direct economic disincentive to lower the cost of energy, to reduce congestion. There are massive governance problems in the ways that we regulate. So the first piece of what we've tried to do is to align the profit incentives, then to address permitting reform. And I emphasize then because a lot of the permitting fights in the US, they look like they're grassroots efforts. They're really sort of astroturf with folks who have a vested interest in the status quo, funding groups to block things through the permitting process. And so we then address the permitting process in a variety of ways. The biggest is to get electric transmission in the US to look like gas transmission, which is to say have a single agency responsible for permitting. And then to do that in a way that still ensures that all the affected communities can participate. We feel pretty good about that. We've gotten a lot of favorable response and feedback and to get it through. Now, our package has been described, not inaccurately, as the Democratic Party's approach to permitting reform. And that's fine. I'm happy to be in that position. But I think to understand the challenges that we face right now in the United States, it's only coincidentally Democratic. If your goal is to lower the cost of energy and increase the reliability to consumers, you should love our bill. If your goal is to protect the interests of people in the extractive industries, you're probably not going to like our bill. Because if we are bringing cheaper energy to markets, more reliable energy to markets, all of a sudden that squeezes out other sources. Coal is dying in the United States because it's too expensive. Natural gas is getting squeezed out when renewables come in because it's too expensive. Build a coal plant in the Pacific Northwest where it's all hydro and wind, and nobody worries because it can't run economically. On the other hand, connect wind power into West Virginia that depends on coal, and you squeeze out a lot of those coal industries because they can't compete. And that tension between, I would submit, every American who is an energy consumer and the small minority of Americans who are in the extractive industries has manifest as a Democratic-Republican issue, primarily because our politics have evolved in the United States where if you live in a rural extractive area, you probably have Republican representation. If you live in an area with a lot of economic activity that depends on cheap energy, you probably have Democratic representation. But that's really a coincidence. It's a cause, not an effect. And I think that gets to the root of the permitting debate in the US. I want to just give a couple stats. There are currently 2,000 gigawatts of generation trying to connect to the US grid. We have about 1,250 gigawatts already installed. These are huge numbers. That's great. We needed to put in. Of that 2,000 gigawatts, 1 gigawatt is coal, 85 gigawatts is natural gas. All the rest is zero carbon sources. The only legitimate problem we have connecting things to the grid is for zero carbon sources. Number two, since 2010, the US economy, measured in GDP, has grown by 50%. We were a $15 trillion economy, now we're a $21 trillion economy. During that same period, US natural gas consumption, domestic consumption, is up by 25%, only half as much as economic growth. Oil use is flat, basically 20 million barrels a day, and coal use is down by 40%. That is fantastic for our planet. It's fantastic for consumers. We have decoupled US economic growth from fossil fuel consumption. It's also really scary if you're in the fossil fuel sector. And so the fossil fuel sector in the United States has increasingly become dependent on exports as a path to growth. So the real conversation about permitting in the United States, if we're honest about it, is not about domestic energy security. It's not about domestic prices. It's not about domestic reliability. It is about, do we want to put mines and holes in Americans' yard, run a pipeline to an export terminal to export that energy overseas? That is not a political winner, which is why nobody frames the conversation that way. But we now are sitting here trying to figure out whether we're going to pass a quote unquote Republican package that, as my friend Garrett Graves from Louisiana, who has led that package, freely admits has nothing about transmission in it and is all about oil and gas production. Or are we going to push for a Democratic package that does what Mike Levinas does? And the truth is, politics being politics, we'll do something in between. But do understand that this is something totally new in the US economy, that we have actually decoupled from fossil energy use. And it is disorienting for a lot of communities in ways that we should be sympathetic to. What do you do if your community depended on oil drilling, depended on coal mining, and all of a sudden you can't compete? As I often say to folks, you can love the steam shovel and still empathize with John Henry. And we have this challenge in our society of, what do you do to these communities that are being left behind because they are not providing a commodity that people want? A key point of how new that is, the US economy today generates about $200 of GDP for every million BTU of energy. That is half as much energy productivity as the UK produces, and a third as much as Switzerland produces. That is either a massively depressing stat or an enormous opportunity. But as we make that move, we really have the opportunity, I think, to do a lot of pretty dramatic things. Now, before closing with sort of some thoughts on how this affects our allies in Europe, the push to build out LNG terminals in the United States has been, for all the reasons that I've mentioned, has arguably given us an ability that we did not have 10 years ago to help get Europe off Russian gas. And I think we can take a lot of pride in the fact that we have provided certain tools in the wake of what happened in Ukraine to provide some optionality, if you will, to European markets. I think as Americans, we are justifiably proud of that. I think we deserve a lot of thanks from Europeans for what we've done, but not until we provide that gas at cost, or at least at our price of production. Because if the United States had committed troops to Ukraine, we would be having a conversation about wartime profiteering. What those LNG terminals are right now are not some broad commitment to the post-World War II order. They are an investment in a price arbitrage opportunity. And there's a real concern for those of us who think about this in the US that essentially we are hitching ourselves to much more volatile natural gas markets by virtue of those terminals. And it's great that we could help with Russia, but I think we should understand the long-term play. So if we do the right thing domestically, leave you with a couple predictions. Number one, the United States will attract a ton of clean tech investment. We're already seeing those huge flows of capital in ways that are wonderful for the United States, somewhat disorienting for the rest of the world. I get it. Number two, the United States will decarbonize way more quickly than anybody thinks is possible. because it is so economic to do so once you take off the brakes, once you allow this permitting process to go forward. And just maybe if we can do that, put ourselves in a position to lead the rest of the world. If we do that, we will suddenly find ourselves with a glut of excess fossil fuel production capacity that cannot compete in US markets, but maybe is a way for us to help the rest of the world transition if we're responsible, especially around methane emissions. And that's going to have some opportunities. And all those things, if we do them, are going to create some consternation with our allies. Arguably, it already is. Conversations about, WTO fights of, is the IRA, because of our Build America provisions, disproportionately, benefiting US countries. We're going to have those conversations. Are we selling gas to Europe for noble reasons or for ignoble reasons? And how are we going to deal with the pricing issue? We're going to have those conversations. They're going to be difficult. And frankly, that's really healthy. And I guess I would just leave you with, I think, the best conversation that any friends and allies can ever have, which was Frederick Douglass's comment when he said, the best friend of a nation is he who most faithfully rebukes her for her sins, and he her worst enemy, who under the specious garb of patriotism seeks to excuse, palliate, or defend them. So we will remain good allies, we will remain good friends with Europe, and we will continue to faithfully rebuke each other for our sins and hopefully decarbonize as quick as we can. And permitting is going to be absolutely central to that conversation. So I hope this has been useful, and thank you again so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. That was very, very useful, very, very interesting, and we appreciate your joining us. With that, I'd like to introduce our second keynote speaker, Lukasz Kalinski. He is the head of the Unit for Renewable and Energy System Integration Policy and Director General for Energy of the European Commission. Until March 2018, he was a special advisor on energy union to Mr. Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council. He also worked for Mr. Tusk's predecessor, Mr. Herman Van Rompuy, advising on the negotiations of the 2030 climate and energy framework and on the EU budget for 2014 to 2020. He's a graduate. He holds a master's degree in economics from the Warsaw School of Economics and a diploma in European Studies. We think, as we said at the Atlantic Council, we can bring together a transatlantic perspective. We think it's very, very helpful and very, very interesting. So we're looking forward to Mr. Kalinski's discussion of these issues. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I would like to focus on the aspect that the representative mentioned a few times as a crucial issue, the permitting. As in the European Union, we have quite long permitting for renewables, in some countries at least, and we have kicked off the reforms of this permitting in order to make it simpler and shorter. So if you look at today's permitting times for renewables, it can take up to 10 years for offshore projects, up to 7 or even 9 years for onshore wind projects, and around 4 or 5 years for solar projects to be prepared. And that is obviously far too long. That it deters the investors. But that is the problem for our climate and energy policies and our targets for 2030. But it's also a more imminent problem. It's a problem for our agenda of tackling the energy crisis and phasing out Russian gas. And therefore, last year, we decided to embark on a radical reform of permitting procedures for renewables in the EU. We first ran a survey to identify the barriers for the quicker rollout of renewables. We have identified various categories of barriers, some of them related to bureaucracy, some of them related to the lack of adequate planning for renewables, some of them related to insufficient employment or insufficient skills in the permitting authorities, because you have these permitting authorities at the national level, but also at regional and even local level. And this can be the bottleneck that holds up the project for long. We identified issues obviously related to public acceptance, and this is a growing issue. I would say the more you roll out renewables, the more opposition you hear, and this was again mentioned also in the keynote by the representative. And then finally, we have also issues related to grid connections and grid themselves. In order to roll out the renewables on the scale that we need reinforced grids, we need expanded grid network, and we also need shorter waiting times for the grid connections. In the European Union, we have 27 member states and in fact 27 permitting systems. They are similar, but they are not exactly the same. So you can't overhaul it overnight. And what we have done last year is we looked into those measures related to shortening and simplification of permitting that can be done quickly, and we put them in an emergency regulation. This regulation is directly applicable in all the European member states. It is also a response to the crisis, but at the same time a bridge to more structural changes. And then we took other provisions and we proposed them in a more regular legal act, a directive, and this, we hope, will enter into force later this year. So we have some provisions that are already in force, they were immediately implemented, and other provisions that should kick in a few months. What are the key reforms that we put on the table? The ones that are already in force. We said that the planning, the construction and operation of renewable plants, of their connection to the grid, of the related grid itself and the storage assets for the production of renewables is presumed to be not only in the public interest, but it is presumed to be in the overriding public interest. And what it means in short is that when the public authorities or courts consider the competition or conflict of different public goods between, for example, renewables and the environment, and there are no obvious reasonable alternatives for renewables, then the renewables would normally prevail. And that might sound relatively abstract, but I can reassure you that with the rollout of wind and solar installations, we had more and more of cases of such conflicts in the European Union that took months to resolve. Now, with this new provision, the judge or the authority no longer have to hesitate which should prevail. The second provision I would like to mention is shortening, and it's already in force, shortening deadlines for permitting for repowering. So you have these old installations, 15, 20 years old, and they could be replaced. For these replacements, we introduced very simple procedures so that this repowering takes place rather than decommissioning of those capacities. Third thing, permitting for renewables in artificial structures. Think mainly rooftops, but not only the residential rooftops, also the large surface rooftops like commercial and industrial. Sometimes the permitting for those renewables, for those photovoltaics was complex. We are simplifying it. Fourth, we introduced the new concept of dedicated renewable acceleration areas. So the areas where permitting will be super simple, super short for renewable plants and then for grids and storage. These areas would be designated by the European member states in the places where you have high potential for renewables or for grids expansion and relatively low risk of conflicts with the environment. But this doesn't mean that the renewables from now on would be able to develop only in those areas. No, they can continue to develop as today, but there will be certain territories where they will have super short, super simple procedures. And then we have the Renewable Energy Directive, so this legal act that we hope will kick into force later this year. It's already provisionally agreed. It builds on the emergency regulation, but goes much more widely, much more comprehensively into the permitting procedures, but it also goes much more into the planning, spatial planning issues, because some of these barriers that I mentioned, they are related to the fact that the member states have ambitions on the rollout of renewables, but they didn't think where these renewables would be located. And that, of course, creates quite a lot of conflicts down the line with the public and with other public goods. So we, on top of all this, we want to shorten the deadlines. And as you see, we try to work both on simplification and shortening of the deadlines for these procedures. Summing up, if I were to mention what were the key reflections that we had, the first one was look not only at planning, at permitting, but also at planning. The quicker you can resolve the issues, the earlier you can resolve the issues, the better. Second, look at various types of barriers, not only related to plants, but also to grid connections, to grids, to public acceptance, or to employment or skilling of permitting authorities. Look at simplification of procedures, not only the shortening of the deadlines, one is the function of another. Look at synergies, and this could be the case of technologies such as agri-photovoltaics, where the deployment of renewables can actually help in other economic activities. And finally, give the renewables the upper hand when they are in competition with other public goods, while obviously maintaining checks, the most important checks and balances in order to ensure that no undue damage to those other public goods is done. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lukas. That was very, very helpful. Lukas has to leave. His colleague, Yana Popkostova, I hope I pronounced it correctly, will be on a panel a little bit later. But if anybody has a question for Lukas before he leaves, you can ask it right now. Okay, if I don't see any, again, thank you very much. It was very, very helpful. We have a lot of common problems in the U.S. and in Europe on these issues. So it was great to hear from you. Thank you. Our next speaker and our third speaker is Parker Moore. He's a principal at the Beveridge and Diamond law firm, one of, if not the leading law firm doing environmental work in the United States. He co-chairs Beveridge and Diamond's Natural Resources and Project Development Practice Group and its NEPA, Wetlands, and Endangered Species Act groups. And he says it's environmental law practice and outgrowth of his love for the natural world. Parker advises clients nationwide on activities including NEPA, wetland regulation, federal and state species protection, including the Endangered Species Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, and CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Before joining Beveridge and Diamond, Parker clerked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. He is also a professionally trained wetland ecologist and has years of experience identifying wetlands, obtaining jurisdictional termination from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, surveying for protected species, and drafting NEPA documents. And he's going to give you a perspective on legal issues that have to be confronted in this process. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Parker.
Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Just want to make sure everyone can see the slides, because everyone loves the PowerPoint presentation. Want to make sure you have the benefit of seeing this one. Is that coming through okay, Ken?
Yep.
Very good. So as Ken mentioned, Parker Moore, I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of both a lawyer, and as Ken mentioned, before becoming a lawyer, I was a environmental consultant, a wetland and species ecologist, and so I've had both the legal experience and the boots on the ground experience of seeing how projects are developed and getting permits for projects and interacting with federal state agencies, and drawing on those two experiences to share perspective on permitting reform with you today. So an important thing to understand when we're talking about whether perception is reality and whether we need permitting reform is that each of the last presidential administrations has tackled permitting reform. This is not a new issue in the United States. Beginning with the Clinton administration and the streamlining efforts of environmental regulatory reforms through the Bush administration focus on categorical exclusions and the establishment of a task force to look at streamlining the NEPA process. Things really picked up steam in the Obama administration with the new CEQ guidance on programmatic NEPA reviews, and of course, MAP 21 and the FAST Act, the Trump administration's efforts to promulgate generational amendments to the NEPA regulations, and of course, most recently, the Biden administration's recently issued permitting action plan. So the perception is that projects take too long to reach any final agency decisions. And then after that, to survive any judicial review that may happen in federal courts. And the question, though, is that actually the reality? One way to look at it, of course, is that with NEPA, that most federal actions qualify for categorical exclusions. And of those that do not qualify for categorical exclusions, only a very small percentage require full-blown environmental impact statements. One way to look at it through the Clean Water Act 404 permitting lens is that the great majority of activities qualify for general permits, either nationwide permits or regional general permits, state programmatic general permits. Very few projects require standard permits or individual permits from the Army Corps of Engineers. Looking at it through that lens under Section 7 Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, most consultations are completed informally with a biological assessment, and very few actually require formal consultation and a biological opinion from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. So why is there this disconnect between looking at things through that lens and the overwhelming view that permitting reform is needed? And that's because the reality is that the high-profile, game-changing projects face the biggest regulatory, permitting, and litigation hurdles under U.S. environmental laws. It's beyond dispute that that's the case. If you look at a project like this 57-kilometer-mile-long tunnel in the Swiss Alps, could that be permitted here? If it could, how long would it take? How about the channel? Over 50 kilometers underwater connecting the UK and France. Could that be permitted in the US? How long would it take if it could? So that brings us to a couple of questions. In many circles, streamlining is a dirty word. The thing to think about is that faster is not always better unless agencies and stakeholders achieve better results. And the way that lawyers, planners, the environmental community, and lawmakers need to look at this is it better to tackle permitting reform on a programmatic basis or on a project-specific basis? The way things have gone so far is that the best results have been on a project-specific basis. We've been able to achieve the best results by implementing streamlining measures into individual projects rather than achieving them on a programmatic basis. The programmatic efforts so far have failed. Why is that? That's what we need to tackle. And so to tackle that, we need to look to the existing regulatory frameworks. Are there flexibilities in the existing regulatory frameworks that allow us to achieve better outcomes? I say that there are, and I'm going to talk about those in just a minute. To the extent that there are, we need to take advantage of those. If there are not necessary flexibilities, that's where the reform needs to happen. So here are my perspectives on permitting reform. And I'm going to speak to where it needs to happen on both the project proponent side, the regulator side, the lawmaker side, and the environmental community side. On the project proponent side, front load, front load, front load. There is an absolute need for advanced planning by project proponents. If an environmental issue isn't part of a design problem, it cannot be part of the design solution. All too many times during the project development process, the design is set before the environmental issues are taken into consideration. That needs to be flipped. That leads into point number 2. Everyone's familiar with the holy trinity of environmental mitigation, which is avoid, then minimize, then mitigate. We need to prioritize those first 2 prongs. That goes with front-loading project design. If we determine what environmental resources are out there before we lock in a particular project site, or particular project route, that allows us to avoid the resources, minimize the impacts before we determine that we need to mitigate. By doing that, that allows project proponents to minimize the need for permits, minimize the need for environmental reviews, minimize the need for controversy associated with their project, and minimize the need for permitting reform. That also dovetails with applying risk management principles to environmental analyses. When you are an agency regulator, look at the issues that actually need to be addressed. There are an entire host of issues that are going to come up during the environmental reviews. The most significant issues are the ones that need to be analyzed and focused on. For the environmental community, for project proponents, and for regulators, more isn't always better. Sometimes more is just more. That applies to documents, environmental reviews, and streamlining initiatives. The flip side of that, shorter isn't always better. Sometimes shorter is just shorter. That also applies to documents, environmental reviews, and streamlining initiatives. One of the things that makes me incredibly nervous is when I see streamlining measures or proposed streamlining measures calling for shorter documents. That, in my view, is a misguided approach to environmental reviews. That is something that will lead to unnecessary lawsuits, will lead to unnecessary risk, and something that doesn't achieve the goal that any of us are trying to reach. The one exception to shorter isn't always better, I would say, is with statute of limitations. I do believe that it is appropriate to have reasonably tailored statute of limitations associated with permits. And that is because if we're asking project proponents to provide environmental certainty with their projects, it is reasonable to also give the project proponents legal certainty with their projects. The sixth point that I would like to make is we need to clarify agency expertise and not eliminate it. The same with their decision-making authority. We need to trust the agencies to rely on their expertise and not to hamstring them. The next point is with any permitting reform measure is to focus on real problem solving, not on deadlines. The problem is not the amount of time that something is taking. The problem is why it's taking so long. And so instituting a deadline without getting to the underlying cause of why it's taking so long is not going to solve the problem. And finally, we need to understand legal risk, but not hide behind it. Regulators that are working on environmental reviews oftentimes point to concern over litigation resulting from environmental analysis as the reason that their reviews take so long. That is a problem, but the real cause of that is that there's indecisiveness in the analysis, and they need direction in exactly what is required of them, as opposed to allowing there to be an endless analytical loop that's incorporated into the reviews that they're completing. And with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up.
Thank you, Parker. Parker will be on the panel, so any questions that can come through when the panel discussion goes forward. So I'd like to introduce next Bill Parsons, who's going to moderate the panel discussion. Before I do that, I do want to make it clear. I said that Yana was a colleague of Lucas. She's a colleague in the sense that she works on the same issues, but she's not in the European Commission. She has her own. She works in a policy research center, a leading one. So first, Bill Parsons. He is Vice President for Federal and State Affairs at the American Clean Power Association. In that capacity, he oversees HCP's federal policy team in Washington, D.C., and state policy teams across the country. Prior to joining HCP, Bill was Chief Operating Officer at the American Council on Renewable Energy, ACOR. He's also a 14-year Hill veteran. He served as Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for Congressman Chris Van Hollen, where his portfolio included climate, energy tax, financial services, and the environment. And he ran the House Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Caucus for 8 years. He was also a founding member of the Montgomery County Green Bank. Bill is a graduate of Harvard University and lives in Bethesda. He'll moderate the policy, and all the policy members, you have their bios on the agenda, but Bill may ask them some questions about their background too. With that, let me turn it over to Bill.
Ken, thanks so much. Great to be with everyone this morning. If it looks like I'm in a hotel room, that's because I am. We're coming to you live from 2023 Clean Power, which is the industry's largest trade expo in New Orleans this year. I was asked, in our pre-huddle before the show, whether the degree to which this topic was on the agenda this year. I can tell you that this morning there is a panel on permitting reform. This afternoon there is a panel on transmission, and yesterday we had John Podesta keynoting, who touched on this relative to the debt ceiling negotiations. So this is indeed a very timely topic. Let me just start moderator's prerogative and maybe pull back the aperture a little bit as as Parker's slide indicated. This is not a new issue for either the U.S. or our friends across the pond to be grappling with. If you go back in time, the National Environmental Protection Act was passed in the aftermath of things like the Santa Barbara oil spill. And also the Cuyahoga River literally lighting on fire. And there was a very determined commitment at the time to put laws in place to slow down or stop the kinds of development that caused environmental damage. And I want to offer that we may be at an inflection point in this moment where that operating assumption of needing to slow down or stop development on the assumption that that is what is necessary to preserve environmental integrity, we need to have a paradigm shift there, that we are at a moment where we're actually going to need to start building and building faster than we ever have before in order to achieve those objectives. And I know that American Clean Power Association, that is an animating paradigm shift for how we think about NEPA and how we should proceed relative to permitting reform. I'm going to turn to our panelists in a minute. Let me just say, with regard to the audience here, if you have questions as we go and want to put them in the chat, we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible at the end. I do hope to get to questions of speed and environmental integrity, and really do a deep dive on some specific recommendations, as well as what we can learn from Jana and how the EU is choosing to handle these issues by the time our half hour, 40 minutes is up here. But let me start for each of you, and I think I'll start with Rob Gramlich at Grid Strategies. Rob, just a basic a problem statement here from your point of view. Why are we having this conversation? Should we? What's the urgency? Lay it out for us, please, and then we'll double click on a few items as we go here.
Yeah, sure. Well, great to be with you. And Bill, I'm going to ask you as many questions as you ask me, because you know this. So on clean energy advancement, transmission's really the key barrier. Some of the lines that are really needed and that we're seeing are taking 15 or 18 years, and that's just not going to work for the amount of transmission we need for the low cost, reliable, clean energy based system that we can have and need to have. That's just not going to work. So a lot of details behind that, but at the highest level, I think that's the basic problem.
Thank you for that. And I should mention, if each of you, if you care to, could just give a little bit of bio in terms of the organization you represent and so forth as we go here, that would be great. Rob, I didn't give you that chance at the outset, so a little bit about Grid Strategies.
Well, we work on bulk power markets and transmission, mainly with an eye towards sort of the future low carbon, high renewable energy grid, which is a type of grid that can operate reliably, but we need to operate and plan it differently. So we're about 8 people. We do economic and engineering and policy consulting to a variety of clients, mostly focused on the federal level, but we're doing some work in state proceedings and RTO, regional transmission organization areas as well.
Helpful, thank you. Christina, same question to you, and please feel free to give a brief introduction about ASEG, but your problem statement and how you're looking at it from ASEG's point of view.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. My name is Christina Hayes, and I'm Executive Director of Americans for Clean Energy Grid. We are a diverse coalition. Our board members include representatives from NRDC, IBEW, Blue Green Alliance, as well as transmission developers, both merchant and traditional utility developers as well as renewable resource developers. The biggest challenge that we see is the trouble with building high capacity interstate transmission lines. There are just many additional obstacles to those lines, and those are the ones that really show their value when we see instances of extreme weather and the need to put on many megawatts of new renewable resources. It helps keep the cost of interconnection low, and it helps provide the geographic diversity so that adding these renewables to the system makes the system cost effective and reliable.
Thank you for that. Parker, you have we've had as a practitioner, and we've also just had the benefit of hearing some detail from you. But if you could maybe offer your own kind of problem statement here before we dive into a few of the particulars.
Sure, I'll skip the bio, but yeah, I mean, as someone that represents clients in all sectors, including traditional and renewable energy, and with the goal of getting timely permits and achieving uh, you know, project development along set schedules. The objective is honestly to try to work with communities, stakeholders, and the regulated, or I'm sorry, the regulatory agencies in a way that allows for efficient permit decisions that are defensible. And as I mentioned in my presentation, much of that focus is on convincing agencies and most importantly, project proponents that avoidance and minimization is the best approach.
That's great. And Jana, welcome, and certainly welcome your perspective for how the EU is thinking about these issues and what we might learn there.
Hi, Bill. Thank you so much for having me for this very interesting and timely discussion. So just to follow up on what was precised earlier, I do not work for the EU. I do not represent the EU official perspective. So I am the founder and managing director of the European Center for Energy and Geopolitical Analysis, which is an independent organization with different clients, the European institutions, some of them, but also private companies. And simultaneously, I serve as an analyst in the EU Agency for Security Studies. But again, once again, I think Lukasz presented really the official institutional perspective, and I'll provide more of a feedback or reflection of what is going right and what might be potentially improved. So I learned a lot from what was presented from our transatlantic colleagues. And I think some of the issues are definitely the same and some are completely diametrically opposed. I think permitting has been an issue for the EU for a very long period of time, especially in terms of not only the establishment of new generation technologies, but also in terms of the power grid modernization within the EU. And I think something that is really closer to also the transatlantic, the US debate is the issue of these power interconnections and the modernization and enhancement and resilience of the grid. And I think something that is currently a critical discussion within the EU, but has to be really ramped up on steroids, if I may, is really not only the generation technology that we need to achieve our 2030 and 2050 targets in terms of wind, solar, EVs ramp up, storage technology, so on and so forth, but also whether the power grid that we have currently is able to absorb all of this new capacity and the demand of this capacity on the grid. And I think this is absolutely critical and not sufficiently discussed within the EU today. And I currently actually do a project on the grid resilience to cybersecurity threats, but also the needed weatherization of the grid, because we don't speak about the fact that with the changing climate patterns, not only the generation of renewable energy would potentially change, and some of those changes are still unpredicted. So this is something maybe we can elaborate in the discussions, but also in terms of the grid, the investment that we currently do in the modernization of the grid sometimes would not be actually fit for purpose for a new climate realities with rising temperatures, more extreme weather events, and so on and so forth. So I think it's something critical for me to pay attention to, and something that was probably not mentioned so far in the discussion, the weatherization of the grid to make it more resilient.
So thank you for that. Based on those opening statements, there's a real priority being placed on the grid here and the role that transmission has to play, clearly. And there was also, I think Ken alluded at the top to a project recently approved, took 18 years to get done. I want to go to speed. Now, and in going to speed, it was not lost on me that Parker's presentation, one of the bullets was faster isn't always better, right? And so I'd like to ask each of you, because we're going to have to square this, to speak to why speed is important, and towards what end, and what specific steps you think applicable laws could take in order to achieve greater efficiencies in the right way. And I'll just say from ACP's point of view, I'm going to steal a line from our general counsel, Gene Grace. He talks about not lowering the bar, just getting to the bar faster. And that's a kind of framework that we think makes sense in terms of modernizing how we do permitting reform in the United States. Christina, maybe I'll start with you this time.
Appreciate it, Bill. We've been very focused on making sure that we're not reducing environmental protection, but we're looking to improve government performance. One of the terms that we actually use a lot, we steal from Europe. The balkanization of our siting and permitting system makes it really challenging. These lines that take 18 years, and unfortunately, there's more than one of them, will have to go through a federal permitting process if it's over federal lands, if there's some sort of federal trigger, and then also a subsequent state process. In some places, the states have then rolled that down to counties in some instances. Where you have an agency that can take more than 4 years, as you may know, that is the length of a presidential term in the United States. So if the administration turns over, then you might have new rules that apply to a transmission line that's currently going through a permitting process. And that's one of the contributors to it taking such a long time. So when we focus on these high capacity interstate projects that Parker was talking about earlier, these are the ones that seem to draw the most fire in terms of having a long permitting process. I think those are the ones where it makes the most sense to focus on having a unified process, federal agencies focused on having a single point of contact, and then funneling also the state review process through that federal process in order to stick the landing, having a meaningful review conducted once.
Parker, I'm going to go to you, and I'm going to maybe make a follow-on observation in your presentation. I think as you were going through your deck, and I saw the first observation about the vast majority of, don't even merit a full EIS and so forth, it could leave the impression that there's not really a problem here. And then you get to a subsequent slide where it points out that the highest impact projects are the ones that are most likely to get hung up. And it seems to me that, we've known for a long time that there's in fact not a real problem building smaller transmission lines in the United States, getting cost per, it's happening all the time. That's not the issue. The issue is these high impact interstate lines that we need to have, grid reliability and to deliver resource to load. And if we fail on that one, the fact that the remaining 90%, happen without incident is kind of cold comfort. So I want you to speak to, given those realities, what's the right way to proceed from here as a practitioner in this space?
Well, I think it's one of the, we have to be very careful what we ask for, and that's what I meant by faster isn't always better. So take for example the directive that came out during the last administration that NEPA analyses would be completed within. I can't remember exactly. It was 18 months or 2 years. If it was an EIS, it was lesser time for an EA. That directive was taken by Fish and Wildlife Service, and how did they interpret that? They used that by saying, well, we're not going to start the NEPA process until we have a complete habitat conservation plan in place, or until we have a complete permit package in place. And we're not going to consider us to have a complete permit package in place until it is a final document that's ready to be signed. So basically, unless we put in the necessary safeguards to ensure that faster actually is faster, then it doesn't really matter what timelines we put on something. We're still not going to be able to achieve the objectives that we're trying to reach. So I mean, that would be the first caveat that I would make. Beyond that, I think that let me pause there and see if you did have a follow-up.
Just one quick follow-on. Did I hear did I detect in your answer maybe a recommendation to consider what might be able to be done concurrently?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So again, there's room for efficiency. There's room for efficiencies here that may be some low-hanging fruit that that I thought I might have detected in your answer relative to how these packages come together and when they're eligible for decision points and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that in my view, all practitioners took to be a given. That the NEPA process and the permitting process would proceed in parallel. But unless it's spelled out and unless that is something that's codified, it's not. And so there is that wiggle room in the regulatory programs currently. And unless that is shored up, then that's going to continue to be a vulnerability for any sort of schedule time or permitting timeline.
Got it. Rob, and also for you, Yana, we're still on speed here. I'm just going to tackle the decarbonization challenge head on here. This administration has goals for 80% decarbonization by 2030, zero net carbon electricity by 2035. And in order to accomplish that, we're going to have to double or triple annual levels of clean deployment between now and then. And Christina already spoke to you're just not going to get there without the transmission to connect resource to load. From your point of view, can you speak to why finding efficiencies, getting to reasonable and environmentally sound decision points faster is so critical here?
Yana, you want to start?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you, Rob. So I think I agree with almost everything said prior to that. I think transmission is critical to start thinking and anticipating already today and maybe allowing some of the permitting to happen, because we should not forget, I should be very mindful of the fact that transmission takes longer time than generation capacity installments. And I think currently for in the context of the EU, we focus a lot on just ramping up generation capacity in terms of permitting acceleration for solar, offshore wind, onshore wind, so on and so forth, without thinking that actually the transmission, it has a longer lead times and we need to really speed up the process. This being said, I think it's very important to make it within the established parameters of thinking about the environment, about the ecosystem, about the local communities. And we have seen over and over again within the EU, for example, in terms of critical raw materials mining, that local communities actually stop the exploration of some of those resources. And it's easier for communities to say Europe is massively pro-renewable, but it's one thing to be pro-renewable generation, it's another thing to be pro the power line that actually make these renewables flow, the electrons flow between different member states. So I think there is a lot of communication needed to accompany some of the accelerated permitting. And accelerating permitting, we should be mindful of the fact that today it's only on legal basis and the implementation takes sometimes much longer. We start thinking about the accelerated permitting in terms of power grid, the power exchange capacity between different member states. Already at the beginning of 2010, I was working on this as an intern. So I think, and some of those projects actually came to light now, despite of the projects of common interest, pooling the Connecting Europe facility, and so on and so forth. So it's one thing to have this really grand vision, and then sometimes at national level, it really bogs down to implementation. And then just one little comment that I think it's extremely important in the context of the EU, and might be to a certain extent relevant in the EU dynamics, is the fact that we have a very strong dichotomy between different member states. So member states with the deeper pockets, with more technical expertise, with more access to financing and more capable utility actors, are able to actually accelerate the implementation of projects much quicker than member states who are not able to actually have access to the financing and the technical expertise. And I think a critical thing that the EU has to deal with, and maybe it's important also in the EU dynamics, is to make sure that all the actors are included in this debate, but also that there is even a distribution not only of the generation capacity, but also of the expertise that is needed to implement those projects on the ground.
Thank you for that. Rob?
Yeah, I'll add. I mean, look, time is money and time is carbon abatement reduced. So any delay hinders our goals to decarbonize, and it's also very expensive. One of the themes I know of this event is on cost containment, and it's extremely expensive if you have to go through 18 years instead of 4 years development. And if you're the investor who thinks the next project could range from anywhere to 4 years to infinity, without any, end in sight, and, what's your cost of capital if you really have no idea what the process is going to look like. So, and just to maybe put a little different framework on the problem, if you're trying to permit a long transmission line, you're probably across many states, you're probably going to interact with multiple laws implemented by multiple agencies, and multiple field offices and departments within those agencies. So it's not the case that there's sort of like one clerk at an agency who's, sitting on an application for 10 years. It's that you have many different offices of many different agencies that might come into play at different stages of a project, and they have very different environmental standards or other standards that they are implementing, and different information sources and processes required by those laws. So really, this is a management problem where, if you're let's say the president and you have all these agencies, there's no substitute for a leadership within a federal administration to say, look, everybody, we need to get infrastructure built and approved, and everybody needs to work together. So these structures, like under Fast 41 and the FIPSI process, are very helpful for timelines and coordination. And for transmission, there's this piece called 216H of the Federal Power Act, where DOE can be a lead agency. Those things end up mattering a lot, as well as having amply resourced agencies, including competitive hiring ability from the agencies. You could talk to former Chairman Glick about how important that could be at FERC. So, these are sort of, solvable, but it's a lot of work and a lot of resources. But we need to think about how do we speed up those processes. We're not going to, I just don't see many opportunities to, if there are redundant processes, certainly collapse those, but inevitably there will be multiple agencies and field offices, et cetera. So somebody needs to coordinate it all and get it all done on a much quicker time frame.
Got it. So the flip side, of course, of speed is participation, is voice in the process. And I think this conversation would not be complete if it ignored the fact that there are historical allies to the clean energy transition and the environmental movement and elsewhere that have some sincere concerns about what speed might mean for participation, for all voices to have an opportunity to participate. I'm going to start with you, Jana. I assume, and I know because we heard earlier, this is not a unique challenge for the United States, but to the degree public participation and concerns or opposition to lines or opposition to certain formulations of projects crop up, and there is a need to move faster. If you're able to speak to that, I'd go to you first, Jana, if you're there, on how the EU handles, and then I want to welcome some comments from the other panelists about how to proceed intelligently and with integrity there. Jana, you want to start?
No, absolutely. Thank you, Bill. I think it's a very relevant issue, and this is why I mentioned earlier that the conveying the message to the communities is critical in order to have this widespread engagement behind a particular project. Then within the EU, what has been done, and I think it's extremely successful, is to have these regional groupings, which actually have engaged both communities, but also TSOs, the transmission system operators, the distribution system operators, utilities together around the table to actually agree on the relevance of a particular project, and then really kind of vet the project going forward together. And once you have this kind of a common agreement behind the importance of this project, it's much easier to actually implement it, go forward, go to the communities. then, as you mentioned, I think it's extremely important to make it within this framework of not only environmental justice, but also local community justice, being able to understand what are the concerns of different communities and address them in a pertinent manner. Then something else that I think it's extremely and critical important within the EU and might be kind of relevant in the transatlantic context is the governance framework driving forward those projects. And I think within the EU we have been very successful with establishing this 15% transmission interconnection target. 15% of the installed capacity has to be able to be transmitted to neighboring states, and I think this is absolutely critical for us driving forward this power exchange capacity within the EU, and can be very relevant in the US context, where we have so many different levels of permitting, of different administration being involved. So I think it's critical to have a kind of a wider stakeholder engagement, and especially if we see what happened in Texas 2021, like the isolation of the grid was like a critical issue, the rolling blackouts, also in California the year before. So I think it's something that you can definitely learn from us going forward in terms of the importance of this transmission capacity and having it available and conveyed in the public narrative in the right manner.
So I'm hearing clearly a recommendation for minimum transfer capacity across regions as part of the solution here. I'm also hearing to you, Parker, kind of a second on your recommendation for early engagement here relative to the voices being heard and EJ and social license dimension of this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect of it. I do think it's important, though, to reiterate the purpose of NEPA. I mean, there tends to be confusion over what NEPA is, what it was intended for. I mean, NEPA is the Magna Carta of environmental law, right? I mean, it's the National Environmental Policy Act. It's not the National Environmental Protection Act, right? It was not designed to prevent projects. It was not designed to delay projects. It was what NEPA was designed to do is to ensure that environmental considerations were injected into any federal action that was taken or that is taken, to ensure that environmental is given due consideration in agency decision-making processes. And it doesn't command any particular result. It doesn't command that the least environmentally damaging alternative is the one that the agency has to select. What it demands is that, given a choice of alternatives, and well, that you must identify all the reasonable alternatives that are out there to the one that you're proposing, that you have to consider what are the effects on the human environment, societal effects, environmental effects of each of those alternatives, and then make a reasoned choice among those alternatives. And so there certainly is a very crucial public participation component to the NEPA process, and that's beyond dispute. But streamlining that process, I don't think eliminates the ability of the public to participate in it, unless their goal is to stop a project altogether, which isn't the purpose of NEPA in the first place. So if the goal is to help inform the agency in their decision-making process of the potential environmental or societal effects of a project, or to identify a reasonable alternative that should be considered within the range of alternatives, then even a streamlined approach to the NEPA process shouldn't in any way affect the public's ability to fully participate in the process. But that said, I do think that it is incumbent, obviously, on the agency to provide a complete, comprehensive, open public participation opportunity. And it's equally incumbent on project proponents to engage with the community, even before the public participation process that's triggered under permitting programs is initiated. That's just good project planning to go out and engage in that sort of outreach.
I think our members would agree with that. Let me one final round here for each of you quickly, and we'll turn to a couple questions from the audience. And it's this, and Christina, I'm going to start with you. Let's drill down a little bit. At the end of this process, assuming we get an outcome, what are the top 2 or 3 or 4 things that you think need to be in that package in order for the outcome to be considered a success? And as specific as possible.
The process, the legislative process?
Yes, permitting reform, and then Jana, I'm going to get to you because I noted with interest, and in particular some of the things that Lucas said in terms of the emergency measures being taken in the EU and how that might apply here. There were some interesting thoughts there, but yeah, Christina, yeah, in terms of U.S. legislation this year, permitting reform, how are we benchmarking whether or not that will turn out to be a success? Not to handicap it, but what the result needs to accomplish.
The number one thing is we need to de-balkanize the process. And so where there's high capacity interstate transmission, there needs to be a single point of contact at the federal government in order to get that cited and permitted. And I know some folks look at that and say, let's look to the federal government. It can take a long time. The second thing we need is to have both the carrots and the sticks. So the meaningful upfront engagement. It's kind of interesting listening to the comments on the previous question. It's not a requirement of NEPA. However, it is a practice of good infrastructure development. So it's more of a policy question. So there needs to be that, whether it's a community benefit agreement that the developer should engage in through the pre-filing process, whether it's there's a fund right now through the Department of Energy that they're looking to deploy to help communities that are struggling with the siting and permitting of large infrastructure that might have a very targeted impact on their community. There are a couple of different ways to solve that, but those carrots have to be married with the sticks of the deadlines. There have to be enforceable deadlines so that developers know what they're dealing with. And then the final point relates to the time allowed for judicial review. Right now for natural gas pipelines, it's something like 60 days before a case needs to be filed in court. Under the federal permitting dashboard, it's 2 years. Under NEPA, it's 6 years. So there's a tremendous range, and tightening up the timing would be very helpful. But I would start with that federal plenary jurisdiction would have a huge impact.
Got it. Rob, what are you looking for here?
Yeah, well, I agree on all that. Some of the permitting bills in Congress address kind of the what we call the 3 Ps of planning, permitting, and cost allocation. The paying is that third one. So those are very, very important to address all of those. The plenary authority at FERC that Christina mentioned is key. The permitting and NEPA related timelines are very important. The minimum transfer is in a couple of bills. Jana mentioned that. It works well in Europe, and we can import that idea here. And cost allocation, clarifying FERC's ability to allow cost recovery from the appropriate beneficiaries is really important. So these are, I think, some of the ideas that are floating around the legislation in Congress right now, and very important, would get infrastructure built.
Parker, your top 3. If you were writing the bill, what would you do?
I'll give you one. I agree with each of the ones that were just said. I'll give you one on top of that, and that is to make uniform the practice of relying on reimbursable agreements by all agencies, allowing or basically requiring agencies, if they don't have the necessary staffing resources available to take on major environmental reviews, to look to outside resources, including former agency staff and environmental consultants. They can come in and serve as contractors to them to work under the oversight and direction of the agency staff exclusively to do the analyses that are needed. That's something that Fish and Wildlife Service has used to great benefit in some areas. Army Corps has used to great benefit in some areas. Other areas they refuse to use. Some agencies refuse to use it at all. That should not be a patchwork practice. That should be something that is uniform across the federal government, should be uniform across the states. If you don't have the resources to do something, look to those who do and borrow the resources from those who have it.
Thanks for that, Parker. And Jana, I'm just recalling from Lucas's presentation, as I understood his kind of bulleting the emergency measures, there were timelines involved, especially for repowering. There were special zones where you could expect, I think he said, super fast permitting process. And the thing that struck me the most, which was interesting because it relates to judicial review here, is the presumption. I forget the verbiage, but it was the presumption of being in the public interest that would serve to inform any subsequent challenge, either in an administrative agency or in the courts, relative to a permit being granted and a project moving forward. Which it's interesting. I'm going to have to give some thought as to whether that could provide, whether there's an equivalent apparatus in our legal system in the United States to consider something like that. But I'm just from your perspective, both in terms of the challenges you face across the pond, but also having heard this conversation, what recommendations you might have for us as we move forward on permitting reform in the United States.
Thank you, Bill. I don't know whether I have a really complete set of recommendations, but maybe it would come later on. So just to make sure that you summarized it very well, but according to the latest proposals, of course, renewables are defined as having overriding public interest. And again, I agree with you, there is a really interesting, almost democratic and legal dimensions there, because this would really reduce the challenges in terms of the permitting for some of the renewable energy generation capacity. And this has been done precisely in the context of us needing to really bankroll going forward the establishment of this capacity within the EU. Then in terms of the renewable acceleration areas, I think there is a critical gap within the current EU thinking or dynamics, and it's the fact that, again, it would create a further, not further, but potentially cracks in the cohesion of the EU in terms of going forward with the energy transition in an egalitarian manner, because a lot of countries, Germany, Italy, Portugal, more kind of rich member states are able to process and to identify those areas with accelerated renewable energy permitting, also access to preferential funding much quicker than states in the central and eastern part of the union. And I think for me, this can create a very interesting dynamics going forward that would decrease potentially, I'm not saying it's going to do, but potentially decrease the speed of the transition going forward. And then in terms of recommendations, of course, I don't really have a set of recommendations, but I think it's important to have really different stakeholders around the table. And this has been one of the big successes within the EU when we started discussing in terms of those projects of common European interest. It was important to have not only ministries and government officials, but also experts, think tankers, and critically, people from the utilities, the regulatory authorities, the transmission system operators and the distribution system operators. And one agency that has been extremely critical in driving forward this increased power interconnection across the EU has been the ACER, but also the ENTSO-E, the European Network for Transmission System Operators for Electricity, that is actually really doing biannually those plans in terms of looking into the common European grid, establishing where bottlenecks are, establishing where missing interconnections need to actually be delivered. And then based on those analyses, which are technical, independent, non-partisan analysis, different member states can actually create projects where they see bottlenecks exist or gaps exist and ask for accelerated funding from the common European pool. And I think this is a very neat structure, and this has driven really massively the interconnection capacity within the EU and potentially can inspire a similar methodology within the US, I assume.
Thank you for that. Listen, I think we are nearing the top of the hour. And so I want to thank all of you all for a terrific conversation. And at this point, kick it back to our host of the Atlantic Council, Ken Berlin.
Okay, thank you, Bill. It was a fascinating discussion. You can see that from the number of questions that were asked. I'm sorry we don't really have time to respond to them now. Some of them related to the status of the legislation. I don't think really there's a good answer to that at this point now. And it's, this the current round of legislative work that we're working on. Sorry. This is the first round of this process, and we'll see where it goes, and we'll know the answer to that on this initial round pretty quickly. I would like to thank everyone for taking part in this. Representative Kasten, Lucas, Parker, Bill, and all the panelists and the terrific panel. Thank you, Bill, for that. I'd also like to thank people on the Atlantic Council staff, if I can spend a second doing that. Jesus Fernandez, Graham McElhovey, Jackson Styron, Patty Ryan, Olga Kakova, Jonathan Joyner, Frank Willie, who did most of the work for us, and Greg Lusak, who helped put this on. I want to thank the audience for tuning in on this. I think, again, I enjoyed our conversation. There'll be a follow-up on planning issues, which will discuss some similar issues to this, but go well beyond that on the planning side. We'll be further along in what's happening in the legislative side, so people can hear about that if they tune into that. So please keep your eyes open for that event. So again, thank you, everybody. Thank you all the participants and panelists. And I look forward to us all keeping on top of this and following up on this issue in the months and probably years ahead. So thank you.